The Torsion Field Theory of Shipov and Akhimov. Author, Sergei Grabov. The topic of torsion fields was popular in the early 2000s, but by now, discussions about it have died down. Most materials have been removed from the internet. The term torsion fields was introduced by the French scientist Éliot-Joseph Cartan in the early 20th century. Simply put, these are fields of twisting. It was purely theoretical, but practical results only appeared at the end of the 20th century. Various devices were designed, and everyone had their own explanations of the theory, since it was raw and didn't fit into fundamental science. It was the physicist Oleg Grinkovich who, in the 1980s, came up with the idea to connect the twisting of water with a magnetic field. Relying on the 1932 patent of the French physicist Rancé, he built a device in which a stream of water rotated inside a tube and heated up due to its own twisting. He called the device a hydromagnetic dynamo. On the outside, it looked like a giant bagel 5 meters in diameter. Inside this apparatus, water circulated, which was heated to a high temperature. The experimental installation was assembled in Armenia, in Nagorno-Karabakh, and supplied electricity to a scientific town. For several years, the generated power was about 2 megawatts. After the war, the device was dismantled, and the invention was swept under the rug. Grinkovich left for the United States at the invitation of the Americans, taking his entire team of developers with him. There, they completed and built a more powerful model of the hydromagnetic dynamo. However, its mass production was also banned there, otherwise the oil-based world order would have come to an end. Here's how Oleg Grinkovich explains the miracle that violates the law of conservation of energy. A water molecule has a spatial structure in the shape of the pyramid of Cheops. 1 cubic centimeter of water contains 1 million molecules. When the pressure in the pipe is 10 atmospheres, the vortex twisting the water breaks the molecular pyramids apart. The hydrogen and oxygen atoms separate. But when they come back together to form molecules again, a lot of energy is released. So, the theorists of new energy, Anatoly Akhimov and Gennady Shipov, claimed that the energy of spun water, which allows the efficiency to exceed 100%, is extracted from the physical vacuum. They discovered an interesting property of the torsion field when it was generated by a shape, for example, a pyramid. In other words, architectural forms become a kind of loophole for energies still unknown to science to penetrate into physical space. The mutual influence of different shapes turns out to be especially interesting. As it turns out, any geometric figure disrupts and polarizes the strict order of the ether, and a torsion field immediately forms next to it. Subsequent research led the authors to even more radical discoveries, which were supposed to replace fundamental science and inevitably change the course of world history. As often happens during times of social upheaval, control over technologies by global governance weakens, and inventors start releasing perpetual motion machines and other forbidden devices. The same thing happened with torsion fields at the end of the 1990s. The team led by Shipov and Akhimov received support from the government and the armed forces, and in a short time, a multitude of technologies and devices were invented based on new principles that fit not only outside the bounds of official science, but even outside the bounds of official religion. These discoveries were intended to undermine the existing worldview as well. In the early 2000s, the Russian Academy of Sciences finally came to its senses and began to engage in the activities for which it had been created more than 250 years ago. The Commission on Pseudoscience declared the theory of torsion fields to be pseudoscientific and, within a few years, succeeded in completely shutting down the funding and implementation of these technologies. Valerie, from personal experience, in 2009, we corresponded with Akhimov, and he gave a lot of explanations that you won't find in any sources. First of all, for a week he suspected that I was one of the trolls from the Russian Academy of Sciences who had harassed him so much that he stopped leaving his house. When I explained that I was studying the influence of astral parasites on people and showed him my website, he warmed up to me and started communicating. Apparently, he read the website about larvas, because later he would tease me using my own terminology. It turned out he was a psychic himself and could actually see both these energy entities and torsion fields. And not only see them, but also manipulate them. and that's exactly why he was able to get so far in his research. I asked him to explain to me how to make the simplest torsion generator. It turned out to be simple. You just need to spin 4 neodymium magnets, for example, by attaching them to the blades of a fan. The faster the rotation, the more intense the extraction of the torsion field from the vacuum. It turns out that with such gentle extraction, it flows downward and spreads out to the sides, passing through wood, metal, and other materials. But there are also materials, object structures, and specially created fields that can hold or reflect the torsion field. In other words, you can actually manipulate it with objects. According to him, energetic entities panic when they enter the zone of torsion field generation. He described several vivid examples of patients recovering when the device was used in their apartment. The parasitic entity that was driving a person to death would leave the patient, and the patient would recover either physically or, in other cases, mentally. Unfortunately, I turned out to be unable to see torsion fields, even though he gave me some instructions on how to learn to do it in a short time. I tested these torsion generators for a while. The effects on the level of sensations were clear. I would always get a metallic taste in my mouth and other symptoms. But, as Anatoly Evgenevich warned, if a person is not a psychic, they won't be able to structure the generated field, and it will pierce their aura, their energy field, and the person will get sick. I was repeatedly convinced by my own experience that after each test, I would get hit. I would come down with a cold. And when my 2-year-old child started catching colds after these tests, I stopped these experiments. Anatoly Evgenevich reminded me of a higher mathematics professor in first year. When a slow student started to get confused, the professor would start yelling, and somehow that would structure your perception, and your mind would clear up. In the same way, Anatoly Evgenevich would start yelling at me, though through the text in his letters, whenever I was being slow, like when I couldn't figure out how to attach the magnets to the fan, and it really cleared my head. Honestly, I think anyone who got to work with this remarkable person and explore the unknown alongside him was truly lucky. Maybe psychics don't actually see the torsion fields themselves, but rather perceive the reaction of the environment with their available senses and call it the subtle planes. There are many such disturbances in nature, including the human aura. Moreover, a person's consciousness interprets the multidimensional sensation it receives into an image, drawing on their individual life experience, fears, and beliefs in one thing or another. That's why, as a rule, they each see things in their own way. Moreover, the repeatability of the perception process is far from meeting scientific standards. It's unpredictable. It depends on one's state and mood. The commonly accepted idea of a torsion field is quite different from how Akhimov explained it in Personal Communications. If it is officially declared not as matter, but as information about matter, then how can it possibly behave like a liquid? The creator of ether dynamics, Vladimir Akimovich Otsakovsky, based on numerous scientific experiments conducted since the early 20th century, came to the same conclusion, that ether can and should be described using the universal formulas of thermodynamics. And in fact, ether can both flow through matter and move at high speeds. That's why it both flows around the Earth, slowing down closer to the surface, and also penetrates it in large streams into the Earth's interior. And other researchers of ether are now convinced that substances, including water, are actually materialized in the depths of the Earth from this primordial matter into all useful minerals. Hydrogen is also materialized in large quantities within the rock layers, and by consuming it, bacteria produce oil and gas. And as it emerges from the depths, in certain places ether first materializes into hydrogen, which in turn gives rise to clouds at all levels, in other words, into water. And those who once named hydrogen vodorod in Russian knew very well who gives birth to what and how the true laws of nature work. It turns out that ether and torsion fields might actually be the same thing, either components or effects of a single primordial substance, from which the matter of the three-dimensional world can both be born and controlled, if, of course, one knows how to do it. I have a feeling that at this point, one might start to realize that magic is not at all what people have been led to believe over the past centuries. Then the experimenters confirmed, if the torsion field is extracted using a rigid electronic method, it ends up being ejected at high initial speed in different directions. And it has been verified, it harms the human energy body, up to and including causing death. Just imagine a torsion grenade or bomb like that, and try to find its analogues, for example, in the Mahabharata. That's why a generator with a cone-shaped nozzle in the form of a pistol was invented, which the operator would aim in the direction of the intended target. At the same time, the operator modulates the outgoing stream with their own thought, forming an image and the laws by which our material reality functions, making them susceptible to change. This is what we call magical influence, but we have no idea how such a thing could be done, let alone repeated. Akhimov was quite clear in hinting that they had essentially reached the level of techno-magic, and the result of such magical influence could be anything at all, up to and including the materialization of objects. But the depth and strength of the impact on material reality directly depends on the level of training of the psychic operator. And, by his own admission, he himself was a rather powerful operator. He gave an example of influencing material reality, so it would be clear what it actually entails. During experiments related to locating oil deposits using torsion fields, their group ended up at an oil site in 50-degree frost. At such a temperature, diesel fuel becomes viscous, and when the workers opened the tap, they couldn't pour it into a bucket. They had a portable generator with them, and the researchers came up with the idea to use it to change the fluidity of the liquid. The operator turned on the device, pointed it at the barrel, and stood there, mentally picturing the diesel fuel as liquid. 10 minutes later, the workers opened the tap, and the diesel fuel flowed into the bucket at a normal rate, as if it were flowing at -10 degrees Celsius. There were several tons of diesel in the barrel, Akhimov clarified. Now think about what you could do with a generator like that. I thought about it once, then twice, and then imagined that you could make a generator with enormous power, and I wasn't completely blown away only because my doubt saved me. Maybe Akhimov is crazy? Why would he tell such things to strangers? Or maybe this is how they squeeze money out of the government. Now I'm sure that not only are all these technologies possible, but they're just a small part of what was used in pre-flood civilizations. And there is a ton of evidence for techno-magic. Check out Viktor Maximenko's channel. Who knows, maybe they're passing off medieval torsion emitters as muskets and those strange pistols with wide barrels. Then researchers discovered that torsion fields are recorded onto photo paper during photo printing, and they do so in a multidimensional way right from the start. That's why a method was proposed to find mineral resources using photographs of the area taken from a high-flying airplane. And there's nothing surprising about that, says Akhimov. After all, the same technology is used by people searching by photographs or by dowsers, who use themselves as detectors of torsion fields. Moreover, humans themselves are built in such a way that they are ideal generators of torsion fields. The rib cage is a resonator, breathing is the pump, the brain is the structure, plus all the internal organs and limbs serve as additional devices for tuning and ensuring the operation of the torsion device called human. And if you learn to use the body correctly, no additional technical devices will be needed. A person, by themselves, is a perfect torsion generator and detector. Think about it. Why does global governance put so much effort into throwing the human body off balance and confusing the mind as much as possible? It's so that a person does not become what they truly are. The technology for this kind of search has grown to the scale of an entire scientific field. I won't retell the stories taken from his lectures about how they shocked oil workers by finding oil deposits unknown to geological exploration. And then all of this was confirmed. How did they find mineral resources, indicating not only the location but also the depth at which they were buried? Considering that for decades after the collapse of the USSR, no development was carried out at all due to the total plundering of the Soviet legacy and the previously explored deposits were quickly depleted, what kind of breakthrough could have happened if such technologies had been implemented? But no, the Commission on Pseudoscience succeeded in stopping funding for the research, and this technology was rejected, and most likely ended up in the West. By the way, Akhimov was aware that underground oil lenses that had been completely drained would refill again after several decades. And he successfully demonstrated this using his spin resonance scanning, which caused quite a stir in the oil industry. The newly minted oligarchs rushed to buy up depleted oil fields. When we talk about torsion fields, we're dealing with an entirely new kind of physics. This is an open-ended science, where interaction occurs with unexplored fields and their properties. Shipov claims that here we are studying interactions with the physical vacuum. As it turns out, the torsion field has some truly unusual properties. And despite the fact that it was discovered long ago and has been studied by scientists from various countries for quite some time, it was only Shipov and Akhimov who truly tried to describe the overall picture of this field. Here are some of the properties that clearly fall outside the boundaries of current scientific understanding. First, the speed at which the torsion field propagates in the physical vacuum can far exceed the speed of light. Essentially, the propagation of a signal in this field is instantaneous. In other words, the concept of time as we understand it in the material world does not apply here, which means that the limiting condition of the speed of light being unsurpassable does not exist for these fields. How this fits with the description of a liquid torsion field possessing the properties of some kind of fluid is still unclear to me. Second, the torsion field is directly connected to what is called the physical vacuum. And since matter itself exists within the physical vacuum, in essence, it unites material objects with each other. Therefore, it becomes a medium from which a new type of energy can be drawn, or a medium in which there are no limitations on the speed of information transfer, since this medium possesses different properties. Third, the torsion field possesses properties of informational influence. The physical vacuum affects the torsion field and vice versa, like holograms influencing each other. This is an entirely new property that is not characteristic of the concepts of modern science. And this informational property has been proven repeatedly by researchers. In fact, first comes the informational structure, and only then its material component. Therefore, by altering the torsion component, it is possible to physically influence or change matter. In scientist understanding, the physical vacuum is not the ether. The torsion field arises precisely in the physical vacuum, which, in fact, no one has really studied properly. Recently, experiments were conducted on the orbital station that surprised everyone. Plasma in a vacuum and zero gravity suddenly demonstrated the properties of a crystal lattice. In other words, the cosmonauts confirmed what Akhimov had said: the vacuum is a hologram that we have not studied at all. Obviously, these facts do not fit at all within the established boundaries of modern physics. But researchers have created devices and technological processes based on knowledge of this principle. In addition, there are plenty of extra facts that only the blind would fail to notice. In one of his interviews, Akhimov says the following: "In order to understand how a torsion signal propagates, we turn to the most influential and well-funded organizations at the time, the Ministry of Defense and the KGB. On the military side, technical specialists from the main Directorate of Space Assets took part in the experiment. On the KGB side, the most talented engineers from the Government Communications Directorate were involved. With their help, we found a technical solution to our questions. After all, torsion wave transmitters are nothing like the radio wave transmitters we know. And torsion signal receivers have nothing in common with radio receivers. Top-notch engineers from the two largest organizations helped create the torsion equipment. In 1986, information was transmitted by torsion method for the first time in Moscow. It turned out that in this way, you could transmit everything that radio waves have transmitted so far: sound, images. It was found that the speed of a torsion signal is billions of times faster than the speed of light. For comparison, a radio signal reaches the moon in 10 minutes, while a torsion signal does so instantly." Another quote from Akhimov: "The torsion transmitter was installed on the first floor of the building and did not have any devices like a radio antenna that could be placed on the roof. The torsion receiver was located on the second floor of a building about 22 kilometers away. Under these conditions, the torsion signal could only travel directly from the transmitter to the receiver. This meant that, in addition to the terrain and the density of buildings in the city of Moscow, the torsion signal had to pass through a barrier equivalent to a reinforced concrete wall more than 50 meters thick. For radio communication without a repeater, this is practically an unsolvable problem. Such a connection could, for example, replace complex infrasound deep water communication. How will the signals be separated from each other, the way radio waves are separated now? These questions have also been resolved. Therefore, ideally, we could completely abandon inefficient radio communication. And if we are going to scan space in search of intelligent civilizations, then no intelligent beings would use useless and harmful radio communication in interstellar space. The authors of the theory established that since groups of homogeneous objects carry a certain torsion imprint, or a kind of signature, they conducted a series of studies in which, using a photograph, they could detect the shadow left by an object that had previously been there. Here's how Akimov describes it. In 7th grade, when studying magnets, there's an experiment. You sprinkle metal shavings on a sheet of paper, hold a magnet underneath, and the shavings align along the magnetic field lines. We remove the magnet, but the shavings continue to display its field. Something similar happens with the torsion field. Only, instead of aligning shavings, it arranges the properties of the space in which it exists. In other words, if you sat on a bench in the park, an imprint of you as a being with all your multidimensional properties remains on the bench even after you leave. Of course, in public places there are far too many such imprints. They mix together, and maybe it's in this very field-like way that we pick up distortions from other people's imprints onto our own bodies, and then end up feeling drained. Any psi operator will tell you that if you capture a clean imprint of a person, you can later influence them at any distance. And here we once again arrive at the level of techno-magic, where there is no place for mysticism or religion. Thus, the humanoid godlike beings described in numerous ancient myths were most likely simply technomages. Even in cases where they didn't use any technical devices, which reduces all religions to cardo cults. Another area of research was the influence on the casting of metal alloys when irradiated with a torsion generator. Here's what Akimov writes about this. You see a gray box on my desk, about the size of a television. This is a torsion field generator. Of course, you don't have to take my word for it. Who knows what could be hidden inside the box? But now I turn on this generator and bring it close to the smelting furnace. The plasticity of the produced silumen, an alloy of aluminum and silicon, doubles, while its strength also increases. For those in the know, this sensation is even more impressive than an efficiency of 300%. Usually, increasing a metal's plasticity by 3% is already considered a success, but doubling it has never happened before. There's no doubt that the gray box influenced the result. After all, I'm not a magician. The same result was obtained in St. Petersburg at the Central Research Institute of Materials using my method, and that was without my involvement. Moreover, the effect does not depend on the distance between the generator and the smelting furnace. And this is shielding. If an electromagnetic field were involved, the shield would have blocked its influence. And we know that the strength of all physical fields decreases in proportion to the square of the distance from the object. So, the gray box generates a field with previously unknown properties. By claiming it's a torsion field, I'm not making a discovery. Such fields were described in 1922 by the French mathematician Elia Cartan. And as we already know, the torsion field of such a generator can also be modeled either by the properties of the sample, for example, the right metal or even another material, or by the influence of a psi operator. And then, inventing a metal with new properties can already be called an art, since the number of possible outcomes starts to approach infinity. It should also be said that, most likely, it was Akimov who was the driving force pushing this idea forward despite conventions and limitations. Shipov, on the other hand, was the one who tried to fit the new science into generally accepted frameworks, to tidy it up, to round it off into commonly used concepts and postulates, which, of course, turned out to be impossible, since such knowledge was meant to leave no stone unturned of the fundamental science based on the postulates of Einstein and other scientists who shaped its image. Perhaps, in this way, he was trying to legitimize the theory of torsion fields, to move it into the category of officially recognized theories. From the experience of Sergei Grabov. At the dawn of perestroika, I myself encountered what is now called torsion fields. We were developing new methods for working with internal combustion engines. Without going into lengthy details, just imagine that you take a stone, grind it into dust, and then add what you get to oil or fuel. After a short period of running, the internal combustion engine's performance improves. Maybe you've heard of something like this: tribotechnical additives for oils and lubricants. We took stones from various places, for example, from the dumps of one of the mines near Murmansk or just from the Inguri River in Abkhazia. We ground them up, performed spectral analysis of the powders, and tested them on our own cars, because no one else would give us theirs for experiments. The result exceeded all our expectations. But what's important here is something else. We ourselves couldn't find a clear explanation for what was happening. Of course, there were attempts to justify the phenomenon, otherwise it would have been difficult to continue the research in a scientific way. Our setup for grinding this kind of ore chunks was centrifugal. The rotation speed was as high as possible for the motors of that time. Essentially, the stones were ground into powder between the chamber walls and the cams, releasing a lot of heat. So, we have every indication here that those very rotational fields were present in the experiments. And then, just for fun, we started placing our palms on the chamber itself while the grinding was happening. We would mentally try to assign different properties to the powder. As a result, we obtained powders not only with different properties, but they even began to differ from each other in their spectral composition. In the end, for us, this turned out not to be the discovery of new prospects, but rather a tragedy. Because no one at any scientific level even wanted to hear about the possibility of such influences on materials, and any developments in this direction were immediately shut down. We tried reaching out to scientific centers, looked for funding, but it was all useless. At that time, we had negotiations with an Italian corporation that was interested in our developments. But unlike the Gliksevich group, no one agreed to move to Italy to continue the research we had started. The technology was buried in the very place where it was born. In the hierarchy of government administration and scientific institutions, there are clearly defined rules to prevent new technologies from entering mass production. All approved technologies are strictly sorted, checked for consistency with official fundamental science, and for logistics. And only then, in strictly measured doses and through a complicated process, are they introduced into production. The only place where you can show initiative is in the field of engineering, and only within the boundaries of permitted technologies. And such instructions for the Russian Academy of Sciences can be found in books dating back as far as 250 years ago. As expected, achievements in the study of torsion fields were classified as secret. And that's why we can only guess where and how this might be used, and is already being used. And how can an ordinary person even imagine something for which there isn't even a name in their conceptual framework? The classification of discoveries, the persecution and oblivion of scientists who strive to reveal new foundations of science, all of this is carried out methodically and thoroughly by global governance. There's not even any doubt that all these technologies are in the hands of the Earth's masters, and they use them to the fullest extent. But each such discovery by people has the potential to bring humanity to a new stage of development, after which global governance would become much more complicated. And today, the so-called global predictor sees the solution in chipping and digitizing everyone to ensure 100% control. And only then will it be possible to introduce such technologies without the risk of losing control over the earthly colony.